All right, so here is our next lesson. It is on pathogens and infectious diseases. So, just a reminder from units 1 and 2 that disease is what we call a density dependent limiting factor. What that means is that as a population grows denser, then something like disease will have a bigger impact on the population growth rate. So, when you have higher population density, you're also going to have higher spread of disease. And this is something that you'll see in animal populations as the population of a species gets denser or the population rises and it's packed in a smaller space. It's easier for disease to get spread from one individual to another. And humans tend to live in fairly dense populations, otherwise known as cities. Another important term is a zoonotic disease. These are diseases that get passed from animals to humans. A lot of times they come from domesticated animals, so we'll look at some examples of some viruses that have an origin in pigs or in chickens, but also there are some diseases that come from non domesticated animals as well. A vector is any organism that carries and transmits a pathogen. And if you don't know or remember what a pathogen is, it's on the next slide. Some pathogens do use more than one host species for their life cycle. And if you're studying infectious disease and how it spreads, you'll need to know all the host species for a particular pathogen so you can know. Like, for example, if it's carried by mosquitoes, okay, you need to try and get rid of mosquitoes to reduce the spread of that disease. Is it carried by a specific species? And kind of what the life cycle of that species is. So, what are pathogens? Pathogens are any things that cause disease. I say here that they're disease causing organisms, although technically viruses can be pathogens as well, and they are not technically considered alive. But pathogens can be bacterial, viral, or parasitic. And I will try and specify that at every turn when we look at some of these specific diseases. So, pathogens have the ability, they have genetic material of some sort, DNA or RNA, and they have the ability to evolve. So they get adaptations from mutations, they're random, but they can take advantage of those adaptations to get new opportunities to infect humans and then spread throughout human populations. It's kind of due to chance when a mutation is going to arise and cause a pathogen to be able to spread, say, from domesticated animals to humans or from another animal population to humans. And so there's that element of chance in there. So specific pathogens can occur in any number of different environments, um, regardless of whether the conditions are sanitary or not. But in general, there's a higher relationship or a higher link between high levels of poverty, low income areas that don't have as adequate sanitary waste disposal, and the spread of some of these infectious diseases, especially ones that are spread through contaminated drinking water. And what I mean, like poverty stricken low income areas, I mean like usually slums that form outside of some cities where they don't have proper houses built, so they don't have plumbing systems put in to take their waste from their homes or the places where they live to some sort of sewage treatment. Only about, remember, half of the population of the planet has adequate access to sewage treatment. So a lot of these pathogens may be able to spread that way. There's also a problem in that climate change is causing changes, not just to climate, but it's also causing some of the more tropical climates, those that are equatorial, to start spreading north and south of the equator. So, some of these areas that are more tropical, you'll have those biomes shifting to the north or shifting to the south, and the organisms that spread diseases can often shift with them. So, for example, this graph or this map is showing that by the year 2050 that there will be a spread in the incidence of malaria. So, malaria is usually a more tropical or subtropical disease, but it's carried by mosquitoes. And where mosquitoes can breed, malaria can spread. So, on this map, the current location where you're likely to contract malaria is in yellow. And then The areas that are red are areas that could eventually become areas where you could contract malaria. And I don't think there's a malaria vaccine, or if there is, it's not very widespread. And notice that some of the areas where this will spread to are, some of these populated areas like northern Mexico and the southern United States. And then green areas will then become unsuitable for these parasites, but notice there's not a whole lot of those areas. So let's talk about some specific diseases. The first one, let's talk about the OG one that most of you have probably heard of, the plague. What you probably haven't heard of is the bacteria that causes it. It's called Yersinia pestis, and it is transmitted to humans usually by the bite of an infected organism. A lot of times, those are fleas. So, fleas are the most common vector that pass along the plague. And that can also be passed from human to human with if humans come in contact with contaminated fluids or contaminated tissue from somebody who has been infected. It can be either bubonic or pneumonic. So if you've heard of the bubonic plague, that was the Black Death. And plague has killed millions of people throughout history, and there have been multiple epidemics or outbreaks of plague. In fact, so this is showing you on the left, it's showing you the second pandemic, the Black Death that happened in the mid 1300s, the one that killed up to like 30% or a third of the population of Europe. So notice that it came from Asia. It reached like Turkey and Greece. Then it actually moved to Italy. From Italy, it ended up spreading to places like Spain, France, England. It spread more to Greece. There was spread to North Africa as well. And then by the end of the pandemic, it was also moving along to places like Ukraine, let's see, I think that's Sweden right there. But there were some areas that weren't as affected, probably because they either weren't good regions for host species or vectors to live, or the population just wasn't very high density then. And you may think, oh, plague, that was like a Middle Ages thing. But there are actually outbreaks of plague to this day. So there have been outbreaks in the countries that are colored in pink or dark like maroon. There was even an outbreak in Inner Mongolia in 2020 because the fleas that are infected with this bacterium still exist. So the animal disease of plague is found in the western United States. If any mutation happens that allows it to spread easily between humans, we could have another outbreak of plague. So don't discount it yet. Tuberculosis is a disease that was especially common. There were some epidemics of it in, I believe, like the 1800s. It's a bacterial infection. It usually attacks the lungs. It's spread when people breathe in the bacteria from bodily fluids of an infected person. So, somebody coughing. So, coughing is a very common symptom of tuberculosis. People cough, and then little droplets go in the air and they spread the tuberculosis bacterium that way. One or two sources I saw said that tuberculosis has killed over 1 billion people throughout history. This would be since tuberculosis entered the human population, and I think the earliest evidence for that is like 1500 to 2000 BCE. So it's been with us a while. Then there's cholera caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae. It is a bacterial disease and it is usually contracted by drinking contaminated water or eating contaminated food. Sometimes it can be just a nuisance where you get watery diarrhea, vomiting, or nausea. However, especially if you're very dehydrated by vomiting and the diarrhea, then it can be fatal. So there have been cholera outbreaks as well. Then malaria. Malaria, one of the websites I was looking at when I was researching this, estimated that almost half of the humans that have ever existed have been killed by malaria. I didn't have time to fact check that, so that's why it's not on the slide. So this disease and the next couple are going to be ones that are transmitted by mosquito bites. So infected mosquitoes bite a human and pass the disease to them. And so then you have malaria is actually carried by a parasite, and it's mostly found in tropical regions and subtropical regions. So the areas where you see the dark red, those are areas where malaria is very common today. But if mosquitoes start to spread in if their habitat starts to spread, they could spread north to the United States, south to I believe that's Uruguay, south to South Africa. They probably won't travel north into Africa just because the Sahara Desert is there, and desert regions are really bad for mosquitoes who need to reproduce in standing water. But you could also have large parts of China start being infiltrated by these mosquitoes, which would be bad because they have a pretty high population density. And malaria is still deadly. It kills about 400,000 people per year annually. I did not mean to sound so upbeat on that. West Nile virus is also transmitted by infected mosquitoes. There can be severe symptoms, but it doesn't tend to have very high mortality. And my bad, I forgot an E. Then there is Zika virus. It's another viral, this one's a viral disease, as was West Nile, which is passed along by West Nile virus. Zika virus is transmitted by infected mosquitoes as well. It is also possible to transmit it through sexual contact. And one of the big problems with that is that it can pass from a mother to her developing fetus, causing developmental abnormalities that can be actually pretty severe or that can cause miscarriage as well. So notice Zika is also a mostly tropical, subtropical disease because that's where mosquitoes tend to live. Now we're going to move on to some respiratory viruses that are kind of related. So we have SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, which is actually caused by a virus that has a relation to the virus that causes COVID-19. It's not the same one, but they're kind of related. There was an epidemic of this between 2002 and 2004. However, there haven't really been any cases reported since then. So it's thought that SARS doesn't really exist in humans anymore, and it's transferred by either inhaling or touching infected fluids. So, what you'll see in this diagram is the number written in blue was the total number of cases, and the number in parentheses was the total number of people who died from SARS, the first SARS. From SARS. Notice that the largest deaths occurred in Asia. It is thought that this virus originated in Asia, um, potentially from a bat, so another zoonotic disease. But notice that even though the United States and parts of Europe had cases, they didn't really have any or very many fatalities. Um, then, MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, was actually originated in the Middle East, and it seems to be spread to humans through contact with infected camels. But it has a very low transmission rate between humans, so it didn't even reach the epidemic levels that SARS did. However, all those diseases that I've just talked about are the ones that College Board tells me to teach you about, but I wanted to include two that are particularly relevant. Probably expected this was coming. SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID-19 virus is also a viral respiratory illness. This caused our most recent global pandemic. It likely has a zoonotic origin. I know there are a lot of stories out there about it escaping from a lab, but scientists who've researched the genome have found a lot of similarities between SARS-CoV-2, which is the official name for this virus, and viruses also found in bats as well. It was extremely dangerous because it was very, very contagious, highly transmissible between humans, and it ended up starting in a very high population dense region of the world, China, and from there, since people travel a lot and live in dense population centers, it was able to spread globally. The estimates that I have seen, the latest estimates, are that it has caused almost 7 million deaths in the world, but it is still not the deadliest of the pandemics, which actually belongs to this guy, influenza. So, influenza is a highly contagious respiratory virus as well. It's a different type of virus from the coronaviruses that the last three diseases that I talked about were. New strains, though, get passed to humans from domesticated animals all the time. So what you'll see here is there are some avian influenza epidemics that have happened. Those came from chickens. There was also a swine flu epidemic, which was a form of flu that came from pigs. So we get a lot of influenza, like new strains, from contact with our domesticated animals. Now, the deadliest pandemic on record that we know about and have records for is the so-called Spanish flu of 1918. I tend to call it the 1918 pandemic, just because it yeah, Spanish the Spanish people don't like it being referred to as the Spanish flu because it makes it sound like they're responsible for it. So this was responsible for killing anywhere from, I've seen estimates up to like 120 million people. This graph says 50 million people. Sometimes it's hard during a pandemic to figure out what what deaths were caused by the disease. And also keep in mind, there wasn't like DNA testing or anything back in 1918. So there might be some deaths that they missed that should have been reported as flu deaths, or there could have been some deaths that were attributed to flu and weren't actually due to flu. There have been various epidemics throughout time of flu. Flu is very seasonal, so people are very likely to get it. It's contagious, but it's also seasonal in that we have flu strains that go around every year, different ones, which is why you're supposed to get vaccinated every year because you're getting vaccinated for what's likely to be the most um, deadly flu strain that season. And flu is still deadly. It causes about 650,000 deaths every year annually. But increased medical treatments and vaccination efforts have reduced the spread of flu throughout the last century or so. All right. So with that happy note, we are done with our infectious diseases notes, and I hope this set of notes did not make you sick.